man stands in a courtyard holding a blade against his own stomach. His hands are steady. Behind him, his closest friend waits with a sword raised. This is how honor dies in feudal Japan. The man pulls the blade across his belly, left to right. Before he can scream, his friend's sword falls, one clean cut. His crime was bumping into someone on a bridge. For 700 years, Japan was a place where the smallest mistake could end your life, where farmers grew rice but weren't allowed to eat it, where merchants became rich but stayed legally beneath everyone else, where warriors controlled everything but owned nothing. An emperor sat on a throne with no power, a general ruled the country without being king, and everyone pretended this made perfect sense. This system survived Mongol invasions, civil wars, and a century of constant battle. It created tea ceremonies and suicide rituals. It built castles that looked like art, but functioned as death traps. And when foreign ships finally arrived carrying guns and threats, Japan sealed itself off from the entire world for 200 years. This is feudal Japan, not the romantic version with noble samurai, the real version, where beauty and brutality were the same thing. The year was 1185 AD. Two fleets faced each other in the narrow straits of Dan no Ura. On one side, the Taira clan, once the most powerful family in Japan. On the other, the Minamoto clan, hungry for revenge. The battle lasted only a few hours. When it ended, the Taira were destroyed. The emperor himself, still a child, drowned with his grandmother rather than be captured. She held him in her arms as they stepped off the ship into the sea. This moment changed everything. The Minamoto leader, Yoritomo, could have claimed the throne. Instead, he created something new, the shogunate. He would rule Japan not as emperor, but as military commander. But this system didn't appear from nowhere. It had been building for centuries. In the early days, Japan copied everything from China. The emperor lived in a planned capital modeled on Chang'an. Nobles wore Chinese-style robes and wrote in Chinese characters. Buddhism had arrived from the mainland and transformed the spiritual landscape. But Japan was not China. The islands were smaller, more isolated. The terrain was mountainous, difficult to control. And the people had their own ideas about power. As the imperial court in Kyoto grew wealthy and refined, it also grew weak. Nobles spent their time composing poetry and conducting elaborate rituals. They had little interest in the provinces, the wild lands beyond the capital. Those provinces needed warriors, not ceremonial guards who wore silk and carried decorative swords, real fighters who could ride horses through rough terrain and draw a bow at full gallop. These warriors came from the countryside nobility, landowners who managed estates far from the capital. They trained their sons in combat from childhood. They developed their own code of honor, separate from the refined manners of the court. They called themselves Bushi, those who serve. Later, the world would know them as samurai. At first, the court nobles looked down on these warriors. They saw them as crude, uneducated, violent. But when the nobles needed someone killed, they called on the warriors. When they needed to put down a rebellion, they hired the warriors. When they needed protection, they relied on the warriors. Two clans rose above the others, the Taira and the Minamoto. Both had imperial blood, but both had been pushed to the provinces. They built their power bases far from Kyoto, gathering loyal followers, training armies. In 1156 AD, a succession dispute erupted in the imperial family. The court split into factions, and both sides did what had become natural. They called on the warriors. The Taira backed one emperor, the Minamoto backed another. The fighting lasted only a few days, but it shattered an illusion. The emperor's power was ceremonial. Real power belonged to whoever controlled the warriors. The Taira won that first conflict. Their leader, Kiyomori, became the most powerful man in Japan. He married his daughter to the emperor. His grandson would become emperor, a warrior's grandson on the throne. But Kiyomori made a mistake. He He didn't kill all the Minamoto. 2 young boys escaped, Yoritomo and Yoshitsune. They were sent into exile, expected to live quiet lives in the provinces. They didn't. 20 years later, Yoritomo raised an army. His younger brother, Yoshitsune, proved to be a military genius. Battle after battle, the Minamoto pushed the Taira back. The final confrontation came at Dan no Ura. The Taira fleet was trapped in the narrow strait. When defeat became certain, the Taira chose death over surrender. Women and children threw themselves into the sea. Warriors weighted their armor and jumped overboard. The child emperor drowned with the imperial regalia, the sacred sword, jewel, and mirror that symbolized divine authority. 2 were recovered. The sword was lost forever in the deep water. With the Taira gone, Yoritomo faced a choice. He could become emperor. He could restore full power to the imperial family, or he could create something entirely new. He chose the third option. Yoritomo established his government in Kamakura, a small fishing village far from Kyoto. He took the title Shogun, barbarian subduing generalissimo. It was technically a military appointment from the emperor, but everyone understood who really ruled. The emperor remained in Kyoto, surrounded by ancient rituals and ceremonial splendor. He performed the sacred rites that connected heaven and earth. He was revered, respected, theoretically supreme. But the shogun controlled the armies. The shogun collected the taxes. The shogun made the laws. The shogun held real power. This arrangement would define Japan for 7 centuries. The emperor reigned but did not rule. The shogun ruled but did not reign. It was a fiction that everyone agreed to maintain, and like many useful fictions, it became more real than the truth it replaced. But could this system survive? And what kind of world would it create? The messenger arrived in Kyoto in the spring of 1268 AD. He carried a letter from Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, ruler of the largest empire the world had ever seen. The letter was polite. It proposed friendly relations between the Mongol Empire and Japan. It suggested that it would be unfortunate if misunderstandings led to conflict. Everyone understood what this meant. The Mongols had conquered China. They had crushed Korea. They had swept across Central Asia and reached the gates of Europe. Their armies were unstoppable. The letter was not a proposal. It was a demand for submission. The shogunate debated how to respond. Some argued for diplomacy, send gifts, acknowledge the Khan's supremacy, buy time. Others insisted on defiance. Japan had never been conquered, would never be conquered. They chose defiance. The shogunate sent no reply. Kublai Khan sent more messengers. Each letter grew slightly less polite. The shogunate ignored them all. Finally, in 1274 AD, the Khan lost patience. The invasion force assembled in Korea, roughly 900 ships carrying perhaps 23,000 soldiers. The fleet included Mongol cavalry, Korean sailors, and Chinese engineers. They brought weapons Japan had never seen: explosive bombs powered by gunpowder, massive siege crossbows, poisoned arrows. They sailed for Japan in late October. The first targets were small islands, Tsushima and Iki. The local samurai fought bravely. They were slaughtered. The Mongols fought differently than the samurai expected. Samurai warfare followed rules. Warriors announced their names and lineage before fighting. Duels were one-on-one. Certain tactics were considered dishonorable. The Mongols had no interest in rules. They attacked in coordinated units. They used explosives that terrified the horses. They shot poisoned arrows from a distance, refusing honorable single combat. One samurai survivor described his confusion. He had ridden forward to announce his name and challenge a worthy opponent. Before he finished speaking, 10 Mongol arrows struck him. The fleet moved on to Kyushu, the southernmost main island of Japan. They landed at Hakata Bay on November 20th. The local samurai rushed to meet them. For a day, the fighting raged along the beach. The samurai were fierce individual warriors, skilled with sword and bow. but the Mongols fought as a disciplined army. By evening, the samurai were pushed back. The Mongols held the beach. Reinforcements were still arriving from across Kyushu, but everyone knew the truth. Japan was facing its first real invasion. And then the weather changed. That night, a storm blew in from the sea. Not a typhoon, but strong winds and heavy rain. The Mongol commanders made a decision. They withdrew to their ships for the night. The storm grew worse. Ships dragged their anchors and crashed into each other. Some vessels sank. By morning, perhaps 200 ships were damaged or destroyed. The Mongol commanders decided to retreat. They had proven they could land on Japan. They had defeated the samurai in open battle. But a winter campaign in unfamiliar territory with damaged ships seemed foolish. The fleet sailed back to Korea. In Japan, the samurai breathed a sigh of relief, but the shogunate understood the truth. The Mongols would return. For 7 years, Japan prepared. The shogunate ordered a massive stone wall built along Hakata Bay, over 12 miles long, standing perhaps 6 to 9 feet tall. Samurai from across Kyushu took turns manning guard posts. Fast boats patrolled the coast, ready to carry warnings. Meanwhile, Kublai Khan was building a much larger fleet. In 1281 AD, 2 massive invasion forces sailed for Japan. One fleet came from Korea, perhaps 900 ships with 40,000 soldiers. Another came from southern China, over 3,000 ships carrying perhaps 100,000 men. These numbers are debated by historians. The exact size of the fleets is unknown, but everyone agrees. This was one of the largest invasion forces ever assembled in medieval history. The Korean fleet arrived first, in early June. They attacked the islands again. Tsushima and Iki fell quickly. Then they sailed for Hakata Bay. This time, the Mongols found a stone wall blocking the beach. They couldn't land their cavalry. They couldn't establish a beachhead. For weeks, they tried different approaches. They attempted landings at other beaches. Samurai met them and drove them back into the sea. They sent small raiding parties at night. Samurai in fast boats attacked them on the water. The samurai had learned from the first invasion. They avoided large-scale open battles where the Mongols' superior tactics would dominate. Instead, they used guerrilla tactics, small groups launching surprise attacks and quickly withdrawing. The Mongols were stuck. They controlled the sea but couldn't take the land. They waited for the second fleet from China. That fleet finally arrived in mid-August. The combined Mongol forces now had over 4,000 ships. Surely with this overwhelming force, they could crush the Japanese resistance. They never got the chance. On August 15th, a typhoon struck. A true typhoon this time, not just a storm. Winds that could tear buildings apart, waves as tall as houses. The massive Mongol fleet was anchored in Imari Bay, ships packed close together. When the typhoon hit, they had nowhere to go. Ships crashed into each other, wooden hulls splintered, men weighted down with armor drowned by the thousands. The storm lasted 2 days. When it passed, the destruction was almost unbelievable. Historians estimate that roughly half the Mongol fleet was destroyed. Perhaps as many as 60,000 to 100,000 soldiers died, most of them drowned. The survivors retreated. Many didn't make it back to Korea or China. They died of thirst, starvation, or storms on the return journey. Kublai Khan planned a third invasion. He ordered new ships built. He assembled new armies. But other problems distracted him. Rebellions in China, wars in Southeast Asia. The third invasion never came. Japan was saved. The Japanese gave the typhoon a name, Kamikaze, divine wind. They believed the gods had sent the storm to protect Japan. And in a way, this belief shaped everything that followed. Japan had survived not just because of samurai courage or defensive walls, but because of supernatural intervention. The islands were sacred, protected, unique. This conviction that Japan was fundamentally different from other nations, blessed by divine favor, would persist for centuries. But the Mongol invasions had another effect. The shogunate had promised rewards to the samurai who fought, In normal wars, the victors could distribute the lands of the defeated, but the Mongols had been driven into the sea. There were no new lands to distribute. Many samurai had spent their fortunes preparing for the invasions. They had maintained troops, built fortifications, left their estates unattended for years. Now they were in debt, and the shogunate had little to give them. The shogunate's authority began to crack. If the government couldn't reward loyalty, why remain loyal? Within a few decades, the Kamakura shogunate collapsed. What followed was chaos. But from that chaos, a new kind of power would emerge. In 1467 AD, a succession dispute began in Kyoto. Two powerful families backed different candidates to become shogun. Neither side could gain the upper hand. The fighting lasted 11 years. When it ended, Kyoto, the beautiful capital of palaces and temples, lay in ruins. But the war didn't really end. It spread. What had begun as a succession dispute became something larger, a total collapse of central authority. The shogunate still existed in name, but no one obeyed it. The emperor still performed his rituals, but no one cared. Power fell to whoever could take it and hold it. Japan fractured into dozens of independent domains. Each was ruled by a daimyo, a great name, a warlord. Some daimyo controlled a single valley, others ruled several provinces. All of them were constantly at war. This period is called the Sengoku Jidai, the age of warring states. It lasted for roughly 150 years. It was brutal, chaotic, transformative. The old rules no longer applied. Noble lineage meant nothing if you couldn't hold your castle. Ancient family ties dissolved when survival was at stake. Sons betrayed fathers, vassals overthrew lords. The Japanese called it Gekkokujo, the low overcoming the high. A peasant with military talent could become a samurai. A samurai with ambition could become a daimyo. A daimyo with vision could try to unify Japan. The warfare itself was changing. In 1543 AD, a Chinese ship landed on Tanegashima, a small island south of Kyushu. On board were Portuguese traders. They carried something Japan had never seen: firearms. The local daimyo was fascinated. He bought 2 of the guns for an enormous sum. His swordsmith studied them carefully. Within a few decades, Japan was producing firearms in massive quantities. By the late 1500s, Japan probably had more guns than any European nation. These weapons changed everything. For centuries, the samurai had been elite warriors trained from childhood. A skilled swordsman was worth dozens of ordinary soldiers. An expert archer could train for years before mastering the great bow. But a peasant with a gun could kill a samurai after a week of training. Some samurai hated firearms. They considered guns cowardly, dishonorable. A warrior should face his enemy with a blade, not hide behind smoke and noise. The practical daimyo ignored these complaints. They armed their soldiers with guns and won battles. One daimyo proved more practical than the rest. His name was Oda Nobunaga. Nobunaga was born in 1534 AD into a minor daimyo family. His domain was small, just part of Owari province. He was surrounded by more powerful neighbors. No one expected him to amount to much. But Nobunaga was different from other daimyo. He cared nothing for tradition. He promoted based on ability, not birth. He embraced new technology enthusiastically. And he was absolutely ruthless. In 1560 AD, a much larger army invaded Nobunaga's territory. The odds were perhaps 10 to 1 against him. Most daimyo would have retreated, tried to negotiate, hoped for a miracle. Nobunaga attacked. He waited for a thunderstorm, then led a small elite force directly at the enemy headquarters. In the confusion and rain, they cut through the guards and killed the enemy commander. The larger army fell apart without its leader. This victory made Nobunaga famous. It also taught him a lesson. Decisive action beats superior numbers. Over the next 2 decades, Nobunaga expanded his territory steadily. He conquered neighboring provinces one by one. He made alliances with some daimyo and destroyed others. His armies used firearms more effectively than anyone else. At the Battle of Nagashino in 1575 AD, Nobunaga demonstrated the true power of guns. He faced an enemy cavalry charge. The elite warriors of the Takeda clan, considered the finest cavalry in Japan, Nobunaga positioned thousands of gunners behind wooden palisades. He organized them in rotating ranks. While one group fired, another reloaded. When the Takeda cavalry charged, they rode into continuous gunfire. Horses fell, riders died. The survivors tried to retreat, but more bullets cut them down. The Takeda clan was destroyed. The age of cavalry dominance was over. Nobunaga's ruthlessness extended beyond the battlefield. Buddhist monasteries had become powerful during the centuries of war. They maintained their own armies, warrior monks who fought as fiercely as any samurai. They controlled vast lands and refused to submit to any daimyo. Nobunaga viewed them as obstacles. In 1571 AD, he attacked Mount Hiei, the headquarters of the Tendai Buddhist sect, one of the most sacred sites in Japan. His soldiers surrounded the mountain. Then they set it on fire. Thousands died, monks, servants, women, children. Temples that had stood for centuries were reduced to ash. Many in Japan were horrified, but no one dared challenge Nobunaga after that. By 1582 AD, Nobunaga controlled roughly a third of Japan. He seemed unstoppable. Unification under his rule appeared inevitable. Then one of his generals betrayed him. Akechi Mitsuhide had served Nobunaga faithfully for years. Why he turned on his lord remains unclear. Perhaps an insult, perhaps ambition, perhaps fear. In June 1582 AD, while Nobunaga was staying at a temple in Kyoto with only a small guard, Akechi struck. His army surrounded the temple. Nobunaga fought as long as he could. When defeat became certain, he committed suicide. He ordered his attendants to set the temple on fire so his body wouldn't be taken. He was 49 years old. Akechi had killed Nobunaga, but he couldn't hold power. Within days, another of Nobunaga's generals came racing back from his own campaign. His name was Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Hideyoshi was Nobunaga's opposite in many ways. Where Nobunaga had been born into the samurai class, Hideyoshi started as a peasant. Where Nobunaga was cold and ruthless, Hideyoshi could be charming and diplomatic. But like Nobunaga, Hideyoshi understood power. He defeated Akechi in battle. The traitor lasted exactly 13 days as a usurper. Then Hideyoshi claimed he was avenging his lord and continuing Nobunaga's mission. It took him 8 more years to subdue the remaining daimyo. He used both warfare and diplomacy. Sometimes he conquered, sometimes he negotiated, sometimes he simply waited for opponents to make mistakes. By 1590 AD, Hideyoshi had accomplished what seemed impossible. He had unified Japan. For the first time in over a century, one man ruled the entire country. But what kind of peace could emerge from a century of war? A samurai stood in his lord's courtyard, holding a short blade. He had committed a grave offense. The details don't matter now. His lord had given him a choice: face execution as a criminal, or die with honor. He chose honor. The ritual was called seppuku, cutting the belly. The Western world would call it harakiri, but that term was considered crude by the samurai. The samurai knelt formally, his back straight. Behind him stood a trusted friend, sword ready. The friend was called the kaishakunin, the assistant, the one who would grant mercy. The samurai took the short blade in both hands. He steadied his breathing. Then he drove the blade into his left abdomen and pulled it across to the right. The pain was extraordinary, but he didn't cry out. That would dishonor himself and his family. As the blade moved, the kaishakunin's sword flashed down. It severed the neck almost completely, almost, but not entirely. A completely severed head would roll away, which was considered undignified. The samurai was dead, but he had died according to the code. This scene seems alien to modern sensibilities. Ritual suicide as a form of honor, precise rules about how to die. But for the samurai, this made perfect sense. They lived by a code called Bushido, the way of the warrior. Bushido was never written down as a single unified text. It was a collection of principles, stories, and expectations that evolved over centuries. Different samurai emphasized different aspects, but certain themes appeared again and again. Loyalty above all. A samurai's relationship with his lord was the center of his existence. He owed his lord absolute obedience. If his lord commanded him to die, he died. If his lord was defeated, the samurai was expected to follow him into death. This wasn't blind obedience, or at least it wasn't supposed to be. A samurai was expected to offer wise counsel to his lord. If the lord was making a mistake, the samurai had a duty to speak up. But once the lord made a decision, the samurai obeyed. This loyalty was tested constantly. During the Warring States period, betrayal was common. Samurai switched sides. Daimyo abandoned allies. Sons overthrew fathers. Each betrayal was rationalized. The lord had betrayed Bushido first, or circumstances required pragmatism, or the greater good demanded it. But the ideal remained, perfect loyalty, and some samurai embodied that ideal. The story of the 47 Ronin became the ultimate example. In 1701 AD, a daimyo named Asano was provoked by a court official named Kira. The details of the insult are debated, but Asano drew his sword and attacked Kira in the shogun's palace. Drawing a weapon in the palace was forbidden. The shogun ordered Asano to commit seppuku. His lands were confiscated. His castle was seized. His samurai became ronin, masterless warriors. Most ronin accepted their fate and moved on, but 47 of them secretly vowed revenge. They knew Kira would be expecting an attack, so they pretended to give up. They scattered across Japan, taking menial jobs. Their leader became a drunk, stumbling through streets and gutters. Years passed. Kira relaxed his guard. On a snowy night in December 1702 AD, the 47 Ronin assembled. They broke into Kira's mansion. They fought his guards and found Kira hiding in a shed. They gave him the chance to commit seppuku. He refused, so they killed him with the same blade their lord had used to commit suicide. Then they walked to their lord's grave and placed Kira's head before it. They turned themselves into the authorities. They had committed murder, but they had done it for revenge, which was understood. The shogunate debated what to do. Some officials argued for execution. They had broken the law. Others argued for pardon. They had upheld Bushido. The compromise was seppuku. The 47 Ronin were allowed to die as samurai, with honor. They accepted this judgment. On the appointed day, they committed ritual suicide. The story became legendary. It was told and retold, turned into plays and poems. It represented the ideal of samurai loyalty, patient, selfless, willing to die for honor. But Bushido demanded more than loyalty. It demanded courage, not reckless bravery, but calm acceptance of death. A samurai was supposed to live as if already dead. If you accepted that death could come at any moment, you would not hesitate, would not show fear. It demanded skill. A samurai trained constantly, swordsmanship, archery, horseback riding, but also poetry, calligraphy, tea ceremony. This combination seems strange. Why should a warrior study flower arrangement? The samurai believed that all these skills reflected the same discipline: perfect control, refined aesthetics, mastery of detail. A man who could arrange flowers with precision could also wield a sword with precision. The tea ceremony became especially important. On its surface, it was simple. Guests gathered in a small room. Tea was prepared according to exact ritual. Everyone drank in silence or quiet conversation. But every movement was choreographed. The way the host picked up the ladle, the angle of pouring water, the rotation of the tea bowl, all of these had precise forms. Guests were expected to notice and appreciate these details. They examined the tea bowl, admired its craftsmanship, commented on its beauty. The ceremony took hours. In a world of constant violence and uncertainty, it created a space of calm, order, and aesthetic perfection. Some of the most brutal daimyo were passionate tea masters. Oda Nobunaga, who burned temples and slaughtered thousands, collected tea ceremony utensils obsessively. He gave tea gatherings as rewards and forced rivals to attend as signs of submission. This contradiction was central to samurai culture. Extreme violence coexisted with refined aesthetics. A samurai could compose a delicate poem about cherry blossoms in the morning and cut down an enemy in the afternoon. The cherry blossom itself became a symbol. Cherry trees bloom for only a few days each spring. The flowers are beautiful, delicate, pale pink or white. Then they fall, scattering in the wind. To the samurai, this represented the ideal life. Beautiful, brief, accepting of its own transience. A samurai should be like a cherry blossom, bloom brilliantly, then fall at the peak of beauty. Death in battle was the ultimate fulfillment of this ideal. Better to die young in glorious combat than to grow old and weak. Of course, many samurai did grow old. They retired, advised younger warriors, practiced their arts in peace. The ideal and the reality often diverged. But the ideal shaped behavior. When faced with difficult choices, samurai asked themselves, what would maintain honor? Honor was more valuable than life itself. This created a society where reputation was everything. An insult could not be ignored. A slight demanded response. One famous incident involved two samurai who bumped into each other on a narrow bridge. Neither would step aside. That would suggest inferior status. They stood facing each other for hours. Finally, a respected elder came and negotiated a solution. They would step aside simultaneously, thus neither losing face. This might seem absurd, but in a world where your status determined everything, your income, your safety, your family's future, maintaining that status was vital. And status was always precarious. A samurai could lose everything if his lord was defeated or displeased. During times of peace, many samurai struggled financially. They received fixed stipends that didn't increase with inflation. Yet they were forbidden from engaging in commerce. That was the domain of merchants, who were considered socially inferior. A samurai who opened a shop would be mocked, possibly even expelled from the warrior class. So some samurai lived in genteel poverty. They maintained the appearance of prosperity while secretly going hungry. They couldn't admit their poverty. That would dishonor them. The system created constant pressure. Every action was observed, judged, remembered. One mistake could haunt you for life. But it also created a society of remarkable discipline. When everyone was expected to maintain perfect self-control, social order became ingrained. Foreign visitors to Japan were often astonished. They saw a country where people rarely locked their doors, where violent crime was uncommon, where social hierarchies were respected without constant enforcement. Of course, this order came at a cost. Individual desires were suppressed for the group. Personal feelings were secondary to duty. But for the samurai, this was not oppression, it was meaning. In a chaotic world, Bushido provided order. In an uncertain life, honor provided direction. In the face of death, the code provided a way to die with dignity. But what about those who were not samurai? The farmer woke before dawn. Outside his small house, the rice paddies stretched away into darkness. He could hear frogs croaking, insects chirping. He ate a simple breakfast, rice gruel, maybe some pickled vegetables. Then he walked to the fields as the sky began to lighten. His day would be spent ankle-deep in mud, planting rice seedlings in spring, weeding in summer, harvesting in autumn. His back would ache, his hands would crack, his legs would tire. This was his life, and it was the foundation of feudal Japan. Rice was everything. Not just food. Rice was currency, measure of wealth, basis of power. A daimyo's domain was measured in koku, the amount of rice needed to feed one person for 1 year, roughly 5 bushels. A small domain might produce 10,000 koku. A large domain might produce over 1 million. The Tokugawa shogunate itself controlled lands producing roughly 7 million koku. Samurai salaries were paid in rice. Taxes were collected in rice. When merchants dealt in other goods, they still calculated value in terms of rice. And rice came from peasants. Peasants made up roughly 85% of Japan's population. They were the bottom of the official social hierarchy, below samurai, below artisans, below merchants. Yet without them, the entire system collapsed. The relationship between farmers and samurai was complex. In theory, peasants were respected. Confucian philosophy taught that farmers were essential. They produced the food that sustained everyone else. They were considered more honorable than merchants, who merely moved goods without creating anything. In practice, peasants had almost no rights. A samurai could cut down a peasant for showing disrespect. This was called kirisute gomen, permission to kill and leave. It was rarely used. Most samurai weren't casual murderers, but the fact that it was legal shaped every interaction. Peasants learned to bow low when samurai passed. They learned to speak deferentially, avoid eye contact, make themselves small and unthreatening. Their lives were governed by minute regulations. What crops they could grow, what clothes they could wear, what food they could eat, all of this was controlled. Sumptuary laws dictated that peasants could only wear certain colors and fabrics. They were forbidden from eating rice they grew. It was too valuable. Instead, they ate millet, barley, and cheaper grains. The taxes were crushing. In many domains, the tax rate was officially 50% of the harvest. In bad years, it could be even higher. The lord needed his revenue regardless of crop failures. A common saying among peasants, "The harvest is like the taste of autumn rain. We only lick our lips and look at it." They grew the rice but couldn't eat it. They saw the harvest but watched it taken away. Yet they kept working. Generation after generation, they planted and harvested. Why? Partly because they had no choice. Travel was restricted. Peasants needed permission to leave their villages. Changing occupation was difficult or impossible. If you were born a farmer, you would die a farmer. But there was more to it than coercion. Village communities were tightly knit. Everyone knew everyone. Families had worked the same land for generations. The village operated on cooperation. Rice farming required coordinated labor. Planting had to happen at the right time. Irrigation systems needed collective maintenance. Harvests demanded many hands working together. Families helped each other. When one household needed help building a roof or celebrating a wedding, the whole village participated. This created bonds of reciprocal obligation. The village also had its own governance. The head man, usually from the wealthiest family, dealt with the samurai authorities, but internal disputes were settled by village councils. Peasants developed their own culture, separate from the samurai world. They had their own festivals, their own music, their own stories. Religious life was rich and complex. Buddhism and Shinto blended together in village practice. Peasants prayed to Buddhist deities for good harvests, and to Shinto spirits dwelling in mountains, rivers, and trees. Festivals marked the agricultural calendar. Spring festivals celebrated planting. Autumn festivals gave thanks for the harvest. These were rare occasions when work stopped, when sake flowed, when normal rules relaxed. During these festivals, peasants could mock authority. They performed comic plays, satirizing samurai and officials. For a few days, the rigid hierarchy loosened. Then the festival ended and normal life resumed. But peasants were not passive victims. When pushed too far, they resisted. Peasant uprisings were surprisingly common. Records show over 3,000 incidents during the Tokugawa period alone. Most were small-scale protests. A village would refuse to pay an unfair tax increase. They would send petitions to higher authorities, complaining about local officials. Sometimes these protests worked. The shogunate feared widespread unrest. so it occasionally reduced taxes or removed corrupt officials. But there was a cost to protesting. The leaders of uprisings were usually executed, even when their complaints were justified. Some leaders knowingly sacrificed themselves. They organized resistance, knowing they would die, hoping their death would bring relief to others. These leaders became local heroes. Their graves were tended for generations. Stories of their bravery were told and retold. The largest uprisings were terrifying. In 1637 AD, peasants in the Shimabara region, mostly Christian converts, rebelled against brutal taxation and religious persecution. They seized a castle and held it against the shogunate's army. The siege lasted months. Over 100,000 shogunate troops surrounded the castle. Inside, perhaps 30,000 rebels, men, women, children, held out. When the castle finally fell, almost everyone inside was killed. The shogunate made an example. Rebellion would not be tolerated. After Shimabara, the shogunate became even more rigid. Christianity was ruthlessly suppressed. Villages were organized into groups that watched each other for signs of disloyalty. Yet peasant life continued. They had their joys, marriages, births, festivals. They had their satisfactions, a good harvest, a well-built house, children who survived to adulthood. They lived close to the land, attuned to seasons. They knew which plants indicated good soil, which clouds meant rain, which insects foretold warm weather. This knowledge passed from parent to child. It was practical wisdom accumulated over generations. In their own way, peasants were experts. A successful farmer needed to understand soil composition, water management, pest control, weather patterns. These skills required intelligence and experience. But peasants got no credit for their expertise. To the samurai, they were simply the people, necessary, numerous, but not individually important. Yet the samurai depended on them completely. Every grain of rice in every samurai's bowl came from peasant labor. Every sword, every castle, every ceremony, all of it rested on the backs of farmers working in muddy fields. The peasants knew this. They couldn't say it openly, but they knew. And above them all, in castles and cities, another class was rising. The merchant stood in his shop, counting coins. Gold, silver, copper, all passed through his hands. He kept careful records, noting every transaction in meticulous handwriting. Outside, the street bustled with activity. Edo, the shogun's capital, was perhaps the largest city in the world by the early 1700s. Over 1 million people lived here. The merchant was wealthy. His family owned several shops, made loans to daimyo, dealt in rice futures. He lived in a large house, wore fine clothes, ate well. But officially, he was at the bottom of the social hierarchy. The Tokugawa shogunate organized society into strict classes. At the top were the samurai, the warriors and administrators. Below them came farmers, producers of essential food. Below farmers came artisans, makers of useful goods. At the bottom came merchants, people who merely moved things from one place to another, creating nothing, contributing nothing. This was Confucian hierarchy. It made logical sense to the scholars who designed it. But it didn't match reality. Because the merchants were rich, increasingly, embarrassingly rich. The Tokugawa peace had created an economic boom. After centuries of war, Japan was finally unified and stable. Roads were safe, trade flourished, cities grew. The samurai had fixed incomes. Their stipends were set in koku of rice, but prices were rising. What had been a comfortable income in 1600 was barely adequate by 1700. Meanwhile, merchants were getting richer. They controlled the rice markets where samurai sold their stipends for cash. They ran the money-changing businesses needed in an economy with 3 different currencies. They made loans, and many samurai were heavily in debt. A wealthy merchant might loan money to a daimyo. If the daimyo couldn't repay, he couldn't easily seize the merchant's property. That would destabilize the entire financial system. So the merchant effectively had power over the daimyo. The social inferior had become the economic superior. The government tried to maintain the fiction of merchant inferiority. Sumptuary laws restricted what merchants could wear, how they could build their houses, what luxuries they could display. Merchants obeyed the letter of these laws while evading their spirit. A merchant might wear plain cotton robes as required, but those robes might be made from the finest cotton, with subtle patterns woven in. A merchant's house might have a modest exterior, but inside, the rooms could be exquisitely decorated. This created a culture of refined subtlety. Obvious displays of wealth were vulgar, but connoisseurs could recognize quality in understated details. Merchants became patrons of the arts. They couldn't display their wealth through political power or military glory, so they displayed it through culture. They commissioned artwork, collected tea ceremony implements, supported theatre. The great cultural flowering of the Tokugawa period, kabuki theatre, ukiyo-e woodblock prints, novels and poetry, was largely funded by merchant wealth. A new world emerged in the cities. The Japanese called it ukiyo, the floating world, originally a Buddhist term meaning the transient world of suffering, but merchants reclaimed it to mean something different, a world of pleasure, entertainment, and fleeting beauty. The floating world existed in specific districts of major cities. In Edo, it was the Yoshiwara pleasure quarter. Yoshiwara was a walled district where entertainment was concentrated. Theatres, restaurants, bathhouses, brothels, all coexisted in narrow, crowded streets. It was officially a place of vice, but it was also a place of art. The highest-ranking courtesans were called oiran. They were not simple prostitutes. They were trained in music, poetry, tea ceremony, conversation. Meeting with an oiran was expensive and required elaborate protocol. A merchant might spend months courting a particular oiran. He would need to be introduced properly, bring appropriate gifts, demonstrate cultural refinement. The oiran could reject clients she found boring or rude. This was a world where merchants could excel, not through birth or military skill, but through money and taste. Kabuki theatre became the merchant's art form. Kabuki had started as bawdy street entertainment, but it evolved into sophisticated drama with elaborate staging, gorgeous costumes, and highly trained actors. The plays told stories that resonated with merchant audiences, love affairs between social classes, conflicts between duty and desire, tales of ordinary people facing extraordinary situations. The greatest kabuki actors became celebrities. Their images appeared in woodblock prints that were collected and treasured. Fans studied their favorite actors' styles, attended every performance, gossiped about their private lives. This was mass culture, entertainment designed for and consumed by thousands of ordinary city dwellers. Woodblock prints captured this world. Artists like Hokusai and Hiroshige created prints showing actors, courtesans, landscapes, scenes from daily life. These prints were relatively cheap. A laborer could afford one. Yet they were also art. The best prints showed remarkable skill, bold compositions, subtle color gradations, expressive lines. When these prints reached Europe in the late 1800s, they revolutionized Western art. Artists like Van Gogh and Monet were inspired by their flat planes of color and unusual perspectives. But in Japan, they were just everyday decorations. The floating world was escapism. People went there to forget the rigid hierarchy of daily life. In the pleasure quarters, a wealthy merchant might have more status than a poor samurai. But it was temporary. When the evening ended, everyone returned to their proper place. The merchant went back to his shop, bowed to passing samurai, and maintained the fiction of inferiority. The samurai went back to his modest dwelling, perhaps stopping by to borrow more money from a merchant. The system was fraying. The official hierarchy no longer matched economic reality. But it held together, partly through inertia, partly through genuine belief. Most people still accepted that social order was natural and necessary. Even merchants who privately mocked samurai poverty publicly deferred to samurai authority. The alternative was chaos. Everyone remembered the Warring States period. The Tokugawa peace had lasted for generations now. Why risk destroying it? But outside Japan, the world was changing. The ship appeared on the horizon in July 1853 AD, then another ship, then two more. They were American warships, painted black, powered by steam engines. Smoke poured from their stacks. They moved against the wind, something Japanese ships could not do. The fleet sailed into Edo Bay, penetrating deeper than any foreign vessels in centuries. The Japanese were terrified. For over 200 years, Japan had been closed to the outside world. The policy was called Sakoku, locked country. No Japanese could leave Japan. No foreigners could enter Japan. The only exception was a tiny Dutch trading post on an artificial island in Nagasaki harbor. This isolation was deliberate. In the early 1600s, Christianity had spread rapidly in Japan. Portuguese and Spanish missionaries had converted perhaps 300,000 Japanese. The Tokugawa shogunate viewed this as a threat. Christianity taught that there was a higher authority than the shogun, God. Christians might obey the Pope rather than Japanese authorities. So the shogunate banned Christianity. At first, the ban was unevenly enforced, but after the Shimabara rebellion, the massive Christian peasant uprising, the shogunate became ruthless. Christians were hunted down systematically. They were given a choice: renounce their faith or die. Many renounced. Some were tortured until they renounced. A few refused and were executed, crucified, burned alive, or slowly killed in other ways designed to break their faith. The persecution worked. Christianity was driven underground. A few hidden Christians continued practicing in secret, but organized Christianity was destroyed. To prevent Christianity from returning, the shogunate closed the country. Japanese ships were forbidden from traveling abroad. Japanese people who left were forbidden from returning on pain of death. Foreign traders were expelled. Only the Dutch were allowed to stay. The Dutch were Protestant, not Catholic, and they assured the shogunate they had no interest in spreading religion. They just wanted to trade. So they were permitted a small artificial island in Nagasaki, Dejima. They could live there, trade with Japanese merchants, but could not leave the island without permission. Through this tiny window, a trickle of information about the outside world entered Japan. Some Japanese scholars studied Dutch books. They learned about Western science, medicine, astronomy. This study was called Rangaku, Dutch learning. But it was a small group of specialists. Most Japanese knew almost nothing about the outside world. They lived in a bubble, and for over 200 years, that bubble remained intact. The isolation had effects. Without external threats, without foreign trade disrupting the economy, the Tokugawa system became deeply entrenched. Social roles were fixed. Change was minimized. Japanese culture became highly refined and self-referential. Art forms evolved in unique directions, untouched by outside influence. But Japan also stagnated technologically. While Europe underwent the Industrial Revolution, Japan remained pre-industrial. While Western nations built steam engines and railroads, Japan still relied on human and animal power. The shogunate knew the outside world existed. Reports from the Dutch mentioned wars in Europe, revolutions in America, colonization of Asia. But these events seemed distant, irrelevant. Japan was safe behind its walls. Then came the Black Ships. Commodore Matthew Perry commanded the American fleet. He carried a letter from the American president demanding that Japan open trade relations. Perry was polite but firm. He delivered the letter and said he would return the next year for an answer. Then he sailed away, leaving the Japanese to contemplate his ship's power. The shogunate was paralyzed with indecision. They knew their coastal defenses were obsolete. Their artillery was 3 centuries out of date. The American ships could bombard Japanese ports with impunity. But opening to foreign trade would undermine everything. The shogunate's legitimacy rested partly on keeping Japan pure, keeping foreigners out. The shogun did something unprecedented. He asked the daimyo for advice. This had never happened before. The shogun ruled, the daimyo obeyed. But by asking for opinions, the shogun revealed weakness. The daimyo were divided. Some argued for compromise, negotiate with the Americans, buy time to build defenses. Others demanded resistance, expel the foreigners by force, maintain Japan's purity. While they debated, Perry returned. This time he brought even more ships, a total of 9 vessels, including 3 massive steam frigates. He was done being polite. The shogunate capitulated. They signed a treaty opening 2 ports to American ships. It was a limited opening, but it was the beginning of the end. Soon, other nations demanded similar treaties. Britain, France, Russia. The shogunate was forced to make concession after concession. These treaties were unequal. They limited Japan's control over its own tariffs. They gave foreign nationals special legal privileges on Japanese soil. Many Japanese were humiliated. They looked at China, which had been defeated by Britain in the Opium Wars, and forced to make similar concessions. They looked at other Asian nations being colonized by European powers. Japan seemed weak, vulnerable. A movement arose. Sono joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. Young samurai, especially from domains that had always resented Tokugawa rule, became radical. They assassinated officials who cooperated with foreigners. They attacked foreign merchants and diplomats. The shogunate tried to suppress them, but it was already too weak. In 1868 AD, a coalition of daimyo from southwestern domains launched a coup. They claimed to be acting in the emperor's name, restoring imperial rule after centuries of shogunate dominance. The shogun resisted briefly, but his forces were defeated. He surrendered and went into retirement. The emperor, who had been a figurehead for 700 years, was suddenly placed at the center of government. It was called the Meiji Restoration. But it wasn't really a restoration of ancient imperial rule, it was a revolution. And it would destroy feudal Japan forever. The ninja moved through darkness. No moon tonight, perfect conditions. He approached the castle wall, carrying a rope with a grappling hook. He was dressed in dark blue, not black. Black stands out against a night sky. Dark blue blends better. This is one of the truths about ninja. They were practical, not mystical. The mythology around ninja is thick. Magic powers, superhuman skills, elaborate gadgets. Most of it is fiction. But ninja were real. They existed as a distinct group with specialized skills and knowledge. The word ninja is modern. During the feudal period, they were called shinobi, one who endures, one who conceals. They were spies, scouts, saboteurs, and occasionally assassins. Ninja came primarily from 2 regions, Iga and Koka, mountainous areas near Kyoto. These regions had a tradition of independence. During the Warring States period, they maintained autonomy by offering their services to various daimyo. Ninja families passed down their techniques through generations. They kept detailed manuals, not mystical texts, but practical guides. These manuals covered topics like how to pick locks, how to move silently, how to disguise yourself, how to gather intelligence. Some techniques were surprisingly sophisticated. Ninja studied weather patterns to predict conditions for infiltration. They learned basic psychology to manipulate guards and servants. They practiced creating various poisons and medicines. One manual describes how to make a water clock, a device using dripping water to measure time in the dark. This allowed ninja to coordinate timing during missions. Another manual explains how to move silently on different surfaces. On wooden floors, you place your feet carefully near the beams where the boards flex less. On gravel, you move slowly, letting your weight settle gradually. These are practical skills based on observation and practice, nothing supernatural. But legends grew around ninja because they were mysterious. Samurai were visible. They announced their presence, declared their names, fought openly. Their entire code was based on public honor. Ninja operated in secret. They concealed their identities, avoided direct combat, struck from shadows. To the samurai, this was dishonorable, but it was effective. During the Warring States period, daimyo regularly hired ninja. They needed intelligence about enemy troop movements, castle defenses, strategic plans. Ninja provided this information. Sometimes they conducted sabotage. They might set fire to supply depots or spread false rumors to create confusion. Assassination was rarer than popular culture suggests. Killing a daimyo was extremely difficult. They were well guarded and suspicious. Most ninja missions focused on information gathering. But there were famous assassination attempts. In 1579 AD, a ninja named Sugitani Zenjubo tried to kill Oda Nobunaga. Nobunaga had invaded the Iga region, home of many ninja families, and the ninja wanted revenge. Sugitani hid in bushes along a road Nobunaga would travel. He carried 2 firearms, still relatively new weapons in Japan. When Nobunaga passed, Sugitani fired both guns. Both shots missed or were deflected by Nobunaga's armor. Sugitani fled, but was captured 4 years later. Nobunaga had him executed by being buried alive up to his neck, then slowly sawed to death with a bamboo saw. The punishment was meant to send a message. Nobunaga did not like ninja. In 1581 AD, he launched a major invasion of Iga province. He sent an army of 40,000 troops against the ninja families. The ninja fought using guerrilla tactics. They ambushed supply lines, set traps, launched night raids. But they were vastly outnumbered. Nobunaga's forces systematically destroyed villages, killed inhabitants, burned crops. The Iga ninja were scattered. Many were killed. Survivors fled to other regions or sought employment with other daimyo. One group found service with Tokugawa Ieyasu. Ieyasu would become the first Tokugawa shogun, establishing the dynasty that ruled Japan for over 250 years. The Iga ninja helped him reach that position. In 1582 AD, when Oda Nobunaga was killed by his own general, Ieyasu was traveling in enemy territory. He needed to return to his own domain quickly, but the direct routes were dangerous. Iga ninja guided him through mountain paths, avoiding hostile forces. They got him home safely. Ieyasu never forgot this service. When he became shogun and established his capital in Edo, he gave the Iga ninja a special role. They became his security force. They guarded one of the main gates of Edo Castle, still called Hanzo's Gate, after a famous ninja leader. But in the long Tokugawa peace, ninja skills became less necessary. There were no more wars to spy on, no more daimyo constantly plotting against each other. The shogunate maintained a stable order. Ninja families adapted. Some became security consultants, teaching other samurai about castle defense. Some worked as police or investigators. But gradually, their specialized knowledge faded. Why maintain infiltration skills when no one needed infiltration? By the late Tokugawa period, ninja had largely disappeared as a distinct group. But the legends grew stronger. Theater and popular fiction portrayed ninja as supernatural warriors with magical abilities. They could turn invisible, walk on water, transform into animals. These stories were entertaining, but they obscured the real history. Real ninja were skilled professionals. They studied their craft seriously, passed down practical knowledge, worked as specialists in a world where information was power. They represented an alternative to the samurai code. Where samurai valued public honor, ninja valued effective results. Where samurai fought openly, ninja operated in shadow. Both approaches had their place in feudal Japan. The samurai maintained social order through visible authority. The ninja provided covert capabilities that all sides needed, but none would publicly acknowledge. In this, they were perhaps the most honest about the realities of power. Power requires both the visible and the invisible. But what shaped the minds behind all this power? A woman stands before a small shrine in her home. She lights a stick of incense and bows. The shrine contains a wooden tablet inscribed with her grandfather's name. She claps twice, bows again, and says a quiet prayer. She asks her grandfather to watch over the family, to guide her son who is traveling. Later that day, she visits the Buddhist temple. She makes an offering, listens to the monks chant sutras. On the way home, she stops at a Shinto shrine near a grove of old trees. She tosses a coin in the offering box, rings the bell, claps twice, and prays for good health. To a Western observer, this might seem contradictory. 3 different religious practices in one day. But to the woman, it makes perfect sense. Religion in feudal Japan was not about exclusive belief. It was about addressing different aspects of existence. Shinto dealt with the sacred nature of the world, the spirits in mountains, rivers, trees. Buddhism dealt with the afterlife, karma, enlightenment. Ancestor veneration maintained family continuity across generations. Most Japanese practiced all 3 simultaneously. Shinto is the indigenous religion of Japan. The word Shinto means the way of the gods, kami in Japanese. But kami are not gods in the Western sense. They are spirits, forces, sacred presences. A particularly impressive mountain might have a kami. A waterfall that has flowed for centuries might have a kami. An ancient tree might have a kami. The sun has a kami, Amaterasu, the sun goddess, from whom the imperial family claimed descent. Kami are not necessarily benevolent. They can be dangerous, unpredictable. A river kami might flood villages if angered. A mountain kami might send avalanches. Humans needed to maintain proper relationships with kami. This meant offerings, rituals, respect. Shinto shrines were built at sacred locations. Often these were natural features, groves, springs, unusual rock formations. The entrance to a shrine is marked by a torii gate. This simple structure, 2 vertical posts supporting 2 horizontal beams, marks the boundary between the ordinary world and sacred space. When you pass through a torii, you enter the realm of the kami. Shinto emphasizes purity. Before approaching a shrine, visitors wash their hands and mouth at a purification fountain. This isn't about moral purity in the Western sense. It's about removing pollution, creating a clean state suitable for encountering the sacred. Death was considered polluting, so were blood and disease. This created certain taboos and rituals around these events. Shinto had no complex theology, no sacred texts, no concept of sin. It was about living in harmony with the natural and spiritual world. Buddhism arrived in Japan in the 6th century, carried by monks from Korea and China. It brought something Shinto lacked: explanations of suffering, karma, rebirth, and enlightenment. Buddhism taught that life is suffering. Suffering comes from attachment and desire. By following the Buddhist path, one could achieve enlightenment and escape the cycle of rebirth. Different schools of Buddhism developed in Japan. Pure Land Buddhism taught that ordinary people could achieve salvation by calling on the name of Amida Buddha. This made Buddhism accessible to everyone, not just educated monks. Zen Buddhism emphasized meditation and direct experience of enlightenment. It appealed to the samurai class because it valued discipline, focus, and confronting death without fear. Many samurai practiced Zen meditation. They saw it as mental training that complemented physical training. A warrior who had achieved detachment through meditation would not hesitate in battle. Zen also influenced Japanese aesthetics. The idea of finding beauty in simplicity, of appreciating imperfection, of accepting transience. These came partly from Zen philosophy. Buddhist temples became central to community life. Funerals were Buddhist ceremonies. Graves were located at temple grounds. Families maintained relationships with specific temples for generations. During the Tokugawa period, the government required everyone to register with a Buddhist temple. This was primarily to identify Christians. If you couldn't produce certification from a Buddhist temple, you were suspect. This policy strengthened Buddhism's institutional position. Every family had a temple connection, even if they weren't particularly devout. But Buddhism coexisted peacefully with Shinto. In fact, they merged in many ways. Buddhist temples often incorporated Shinto shrines. Kami were sometimes interpreted as manifestations of Buddhist deities. This syncretism, the blending of different beliefs, characterized Japanese religion. People didn't see contradiction. They used whatever beliefs and practices seemed helpful for a given situation. Ancestor veneration cut across both traditions. The dead were not gone. They remained part of the family, watching over the living. Families maintained home altars with tablets representing deceased relatives. They made offerings of food, incense, and prayers. During the Obon festival in summer, it was believed that ancestors' spirits returned to visit. Families welcomed them with lanterns, prepared special foods, performed dances. This created a sense of continuity. You were not just an individual, you were a link in a chain stretching back through your ancestors and forward through your descendants. This had practical implications. Your actions reflected on your ancestors. If you behaved dishonorably, you shamed your entire lineage. If you acted with honor, you brought credit to your family name. This reinforced the importance of duty and proper behavior. You weren't just responsible for yourself, you were responsible to your ancestors and descendants. Confucianism added another layer to this worldview. Confucianism is not exactly a religion, it's more a philosophy of social order. It taught that society functions best when everyone knows their place and fulfills their role. There are proper relationships between ruler and subject, parent and child, husband and wife, older and younger, friend and friend. Each relationship has duties. The ruler should be benevolent, the subject loyal. The parent should be caring, the child obedient. The Tokugawa shogunate embraced Confucianism. It provided philosophical justification for their rigid social hierarchy. Confucian scholars taught that social stability required everyone accepting their position. Ambition to rise above your station was not admirable, it was disruptive. This helped maintain the feudal system. If everyone believed that social order was natural and proper, they would be less likely to rebel. But Confucianism also imposed duties on the powerful. A ruler who was cruel or incompetent violated Confucian principles. This provided some check on arbitrary power. All these belief systems, Shinto, Buddhism, Confucianism, ancestor veneration, wove together. They shaped how people understood their place in the world. Life was not random or meaningless. It had structure, connections, significance. You were part of a family, a village, a nation. You had relationships with the living and the dead, with spirits and deities. Your actions mattered. They affected your karma, your family's honor, your relationship with the sacred. This worldview encouraged acceptance. Suffering was inevitable. Buddhism taught this clearly. Your social position was fixed. Confucianism reinforced this. The important thing was to fulfill your duties with grace and honor. But this didn't mean resignation. Within your role, you could excel. A farmer might not be able to become a samurai, but he could become an excellent farmer. A merchant might be considered socially inferior, but he could demonstrate refinement through cultural patronage. The spiritual landscape of feudal Japan was rich, complex, and deeply integrated into daily life. It provided meaning, structure, and comfort. But it also reinforced the very system that limited people's freedom. And when that system finally began to crumble, the spiritual foundations crumbled with it. The castle rose from the plain, white walls gleaming in sunlight, multiple curved roofs stacked upward, each layer slightly smaller than the one below. It looked delicate, almost decorative. But it was a fortress. Japanese castles evolved during the Warring States period. Earlier fortifications had been simple, wooden palisades on hilltops, earthwork barriers. But as warfare intensified and firearms appeared, castles became more sophisticated. The classic Japanese castle combined stone foundations with wooden superstructures. The base was a massive stone wall, built without mortar. Skilled stonemasons shaped rocks to fit together precisely. These walls curved slightly outward as they rose. This made them harder to scale and more stable against earthquakes. Above the stone base rose wooden buildings. The central keep, the Tenshu, was the castle's most distinctive feature. From outside, it appeared to have multiple stories, each with its own roof. But inside, the layout was often different. What looked like 5 stories might contain 6 or 7 interior floors. This was deliberate. The hidden floors provided tactical advantages. Attackers couldn't accurately judge the keep's internal structure. Castle defenses were ingenious. The approach to a castle followed a winding path. Multiple gates blocked the way, each heavily fortified. Between gates were courtyards where attackers would be trapped under fire from surrounding walls. The walls had openings for defense, rectangular openings for arrows, triangular openings for guns, circular openings for observing without exposing yourself. Some castles had stone-dropping windows, openings in overhanging sections where defenders could drop rocks or pour boiling water on attackers below. Inside the keep, steep stairs connected the floors. These stairs were narrow and irregularly spaced. Attackers would struggle to climb them, while defenders could easily pick them off. But castles were not just military structures. They were also residences and administrative centers. The daimyo lived in the castle with his family and closest retainers. The castle grounds included storage buildings, barracks, workshops. During peacetime, the castle was the center of domain governance. Officials met there, taxes were collected there, justice was administered there. The castle's appearance communicated power. A tall, impressive castle told everyone, subjects and rivals alike, that this daimyo was strong. The interiors were elaborately decorated. Sliding doors and walls were painted with gold leaf and brilliant colors. The greatest artists were commissioned to create these paintings. Himeji Castle is perhaps the most beautiful surviving example. Its white plaster walls earned it the nickname White Heron Castle. The complex includes over 80 buildings, all connected by a maze of paths and gates. An attacker trying to reach the main keep would have to navigate this maze while under constant fire. Dead ends and switchbacks would confuse invaders. Yet it was never attacked. Perhaps its formidable defenses deterred enemies. When the Tokugawa shogunate established peace, castle building continued, but the rules changed. The shogunate decreed that each domain could have only one castle. All other fortifications had to be destroyed. This reduced the daimyo's military capacity. With only one castle, they couldn't control their domains as effectively, and if they rebelled, they had nowhere to retreat. The shogunate also required that major renovations receive approval. This prevented daimyo from strengthening their defenses secretly. Despite these restrictions, castles remained important. Towns grew around them. The area immediately below the castle, the Jokomachi or castle town, became the domain's commercial and cultural center. Samurai lived close to the castle. Merchants and artisans lived in designated districts further away. The layout was carefully planned, both for defense and for social control. Temple districts were often placed at the town's edges. In case of attack, these could serve as secondary defensive positions. The castle embodied the feudal order. At the top, literally and figuratively, was the daimyo. Below him, in descending order, were his retainers, the townspeople, the surrounding villages. Everyone looked up at the castle. It was a constant reminder of who held power. But castles also represented vulnerability. They required enormous resources to maintain. The wooden structures needed constant repair. Stone walls shifted and required adjustment. Fire was a constant threat. Many castle keeps burned down and had to be rebuilt. During the Meiji Restoration, when the shogunate fell and the emperor was restored to power, many castles were destroyed. The new government viewed them as symbols of the old feudal system. They were dismantled, sold for scrap, or simply abandoned. Of the thousands of castles that once existed, only a dozen original keeps survive today. But they remain powerful symbols. They represent a time when power was visible, hierarchical, and absolute. A time that was ending. The samurai removed his swords for the last time. 2 blades, the long katana and the short wakizashi. For centuries, these swords had been the mark of his class. Only samurai could wear 2 swords. It was privilege, identity, power. But in 1876 AD, the Meiji government issued a decree. Samurai could no longer wear swords in public. With this single law, 700 years of tradition ended. The Meiji Restoration transformed Japan with stunning speed. When the shogunate fell in 1868 AD, Japan was a feudal society. By 1900, it was an industrial power with a modern military and a constitutional government. How did this happen so quickly? The leaders of the Meiji Restoration were pragmatic. They had seen what happened to China and other Asian nations that resisted Western influence. They had been defeated, colonized, or forced into humiliating treaties. Japan, they decided, would not suffer the same fate. Their strategy was simple: learn from the West, adopt what worked, preserve what was essential. They sent missions to Europe and America to study everything: education systems, legal codes, military organization, industrial production, banking systems. Japanese students went abroad to study. Foreign experts were brought to Japan to teach. But modernization required destroying the old system. The domains were abolished. The daimyo lost their land and authority. Japan was reorganized into prefectures governed by officials appointed by the central government. The samurai class was dismantled. First, their stipends were converted from rice to cash payments. Then those payments were reduced. Finally, they were eliminated entirely. Samurai were offered one-time payments to give up their status. Some invested this money and adapted successfully. Many lost it and fell into poverty. The social hierarchy was officially abolished. Legally, everyone was now equal. Of course, real equality didn't materialize overnight. Former samurai still had education and connections. Many became government officials, military officers, or businessmen. But their special status was gone. Some samurai couldn't accept this. In 1877 AD, a rebellion erupted in Satsuma Domain. Former samurai, led by Saigo Takamori, a hero of the Meiji Restoration itself, rose up against the government. They saw the reforms as a betrayal of everything they valued. The warrior class was being destroyed. Traditional values were being abandoned. The rebellion lasted 8 months. The government fielded a conscript army, peasants and commoners with modern rifles. The rebels fought with traditional weapons and samurai tactics. The outcome was inevitable. At the final battle, Saigo and his remaining followers, perhaps a few hundred men, faced an army of thousands. They charged with swords against modern rifles. Saigo was mortally wounded. He committed seppuku on the battlefield. His death marked the end of the samurai as a political and military force. But the samurai legend grew stronger. Even as Japan modernized rapidly, people looked back nostalgically at the samurai era. The values of loyalty, honor, discipline, these were held up as uniquely Japanese virtues. Bushido was codified and promoted. Books like Bushido, The Soul of Japan, presented the samurai code as the essence of Japanese character. The military adopted samurai symbols and rhetoric. Soldiers were told they were carrying on samurai traditions. This had dangerous consequences. In the 1930s and 40s, ultranationalist military leaders used samurai imagery to justify aggression. They claimed Japan had a special destiny, that Japanese spirit would overcome material disadvantages. The kamikaze pilots of World War II were explicitly compared to samurai. Their willingness to die for their cause was presented as the ultimate expression of Bushido. But this was a distortion. Real samurai valued life and fought to survive. Suicide attacks were desperate tactics, not honored traditions. The samurai myth became a tool. People selected what they wanted from history and ignored the rest. After Japan's defeat in World War II, the occupation forces tried to suppress samurai culture. They banned films and stories glorifying feudal values. But you can't erase history. The castles still stood, the swords still existed, the stories were still remembered. Today, feudal Japan fascinates people worldwide. Samurai films, anime, manga, video games, all draw on these images. But what should we take from this history? Feudal Japan was a complex system. It created remarkable art, architecture, and literature. It developed sophisticated philosophies of honor and duty. But it was also brutal and restrictive. Most people lived with limited freedom, heavy taxation, and constant supervision. Violence was ever present. Your birth determined your fate. The samurai code emphasized honor, but that honor was selective. It applied within the warrior class. Peasants received little consideration. Perhaps the real lesson is about change. Feudal Japan seemed permanent, inevitable, natural. The same families had ruled the same lands for generations. The social hierarchy was justified by philosophy and enforced by law. But it ended. Within a few decades, almost everything changed. The castles became museums. The swords became artifacts. The samurai became salarymen. No system lasts forever. That farmer still kneels in the rice paddy. Not literally. He died centuries ago. But somewhere in his history, he represents something important. He was the foundation of everything. The lord in the castle depended on the rice this farmer grew. The samurai's sword was paid for by the farmer's labor. The merchant's wealth came from moving the farmer's harvest. Yet the farmer had almost no power. This was the central contradiction of feudal Japan. The system claimed to be based on natural hierarchy, cosmic order, timeless tradition. But it was maintained by force and belief. When people stopped believing, when force proved insufficient, it collapsed. We've traveled through 7 centuries. We saw the rise of the warrior class, the chaos of constant war, the rigid peace of the Tokugawa era. We watched samurai live and die by their code. We saw peasants toil in fields that fed everyone else. We glimpsed merchants creating a hidden world of culture and commerce. We learned that ninja were practical spies, not magical warriors. We explored the religious landscape that shaped how people understood existence. We stood before castles that embodied power and hierarchy. And we saw it all end when modernity arrived. Feudal Japan left lasting marks. Modern Japan still values many things that feudal Japan emphasized: group harmony over individual expression, duty and obligation in relationships, respect for hierarchy and seniority, appreciation for aesthetic refinement. But the system itself is gone. No one can tell you that you must remain in the class you were born into. No lord holds power of life and death over you. You can travel freely, choose your occupation, marry whom you wish. These freedoms would have seemed impossible to our farmer in the rice paddy. Perhaps that's the real story. Not the samurai battles or the castles or the elaborate ceremonies, but the gradual expansion of human freedom. Feudal Japan was a world where your place was fixed, where stepping out of line meant death, where individual desires were subordinated to group needs. It created great art and deep philosophy, but it was built on suffering and restriction. When it fell, people mourned its passing. They remembered the beautiful tea ceremonies, not the crushing taxes. They recalled the samurai's honor, not their license to kill. Nostalgia always simplifies, but understanding the complexity is important. Feudal Japan was neither a romantic paradise nor a simple tyranny. It was a human society with all the contradictions that implies. People loved and hated. They created beauty and inflicted cruelty. They followed codes and broke them. They believed deeply and doubted quietly. They were human. That farmer in the rice paddy worked because he had to, but maybe some mornings, as the sun rose over the mountains and the mist lifted from the water, he felt something else. Maybe he saw beauty in the way rice plants swayed in the breeze. Maybe he felt satisfaction in work done well. Maybe he found meaning in continuing what his ancestors had done, in providing for his family. The system was unjust, but the people within it were still people. They found ways to live, to create meaning, to experience joy even under constraint. 700 years of feudal Japan, millions of lives lived within that system, countless stories lost to time. But the echoes remain. In castles that still stand against the sky, in swords preserved in museums, in paintings on temple walls, in stories still told. The past is never truly gone. It lives in memory, in objects, in the landscape itself. And sometimes, late at night, you can almost see them, the samurai walking ancient roads, the merchant counting coins by candlelight, the ninja disappearing into shadow, the farmer kneeling in the rice paddy as dawn breaks. Feudal Japan, a world of shadows and steel, honor and rice, beauty and brutality. A world that shaped modern Japan, a world that still fascinates us. A world that finally teaches us something simple. All systems change, all hierarchies fall, all certainties fade. But the human story continues. And that story is always worth understanding.